Hello, everyone. My name is Christian, and welcome back to my hobby blog. I'm excited today because I have the honor to have Dr. Philip Chase with me today to explore the question of what makes epic fantasy epic. This discussion will contain very light spoilers, so anyone who hasn't read the series that we will mention throughout this video should be safe to watch this. Before we sink our teeth into this topic, though, I would like Philip to give us a quick introduction for any viewers who are not familiar with your channel. So, welcome.
Thank you, Christian. I'm very happy to be here, delighted by the invitation, and I am really interested in this topic, which I've had discussions before about and never come to a quite completely satisfying answer, but it is worth exploring for sure. But yes, my channel is about fantasy. I focus on fantasy literature on my channel, and really the purpose couple of purposes really behind it. One was to explore fantasy as literature because I believe that there's a lot of great works within the fantasy genre that are worthy of critical exploration. And so I love being in discussions and I love doing reviews and kind of deep dives and stuff like that into fantasy literature on my channel. And yeah, that's pretty much me on YouTube. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we can just jump right into sort of the first question that I have. I have
Okay.
a list of questions that I prepared. And the first one, which we should probably start off with, is what does epic fantasy mean? And what puts fantasy in a different class than other fantasy works?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd love to hear your answer to it as well. But I'll throw out a couple possibilities. As I said, I don't think there is a completely not a, there's no definition that's going to satisfy everyone out there for sure. But it's worth trying to tackle, and I think maybe you could start by taking it apart into its two parts. There's epic and there's fantasy. So what do we mean by epic and what do we mean by fantasy? So if we're talking about the modern genre of fantasy, it seems to be literature that includes magic and other worlds or uh, presentations of our world that include more magic than we would typically encounter in our actual lives. We have um, lots of inspiration in fantasy from older forms of literature from around the world, but these are often talked about as myth, right? So fantasy isn't myth, but it is very much inspired by myth and legend and other older stories. It seems to fantasy seems to like to engage with a lot of the tropes and archetypes and things that you commonly find in myth. So in that sense, at least if you're considering the use of the fantastic, fantasy has something in common with very old forms of story. Epic fantasy also suggests engagement with some kind of older form of story because epic, if you just take a very literal definition and you look at the maybe like the classical epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid and that kind of thing, what was the purpose of epics? There are a few purposes, but I think that storytelling in those days was one means by which a culture established its identity. In other words, you would listen to old tales, the epics, and everybody knew these stories. That didn't matter. I mean, the bard was retelling a story that everybody knew. It was a performance of a story that everybody would have shared in common. So it's common property. And these stories are very central to the identity of a culture. So they are means by which people assert their identity as a culture, and also they are vehicles for conferring meaning upon people as a collective. So I think that when we look at epic fantasy, obviously fantasy is not like these older epics and the myths and all that in the sense that it's not a collective property. Fantasy is the spring from the imagination of a specific author. So there's not quite that same level of a broad um, shared property that you have with myth and legend and epic and all of that. But I do feel that fantasy is a response in our modern world to a sense that these older stories seem to have been part of how people felt a sense of meaning in their lives. And we modern people, ever since, let's say, the Industrial Revolution, maybe even earlier, but we have increasingly felt less sense of cohesion, less sense of purpose and meaning, especially as there are certain institutions that were central to our culture. I'm talking about Western culture primarily here, but I think that with globalization, industrialization, these are things that have affected the entire world. So a lot of people feel that there's no coherence any longer, that we don't have this central narrative that most people believe in, or a group of gods or legends or whatever, that everything is sort of just out there. And a lot of people feel that there is no intrinsic meaning to our existence any longer, that we don't have this cohesion, we don't have this narrative. And so in one sense, epic fantasy, and I'm giving a lot of this some of these ideas, I'm rephrasing and perhaps changing a little bit, but a lot of these ideas I'm talking about right now are coming from the author Stephen Donaldson, who was a very famous fantasy writer himself, wrote the Thomas Covenant series, and he wrote a couple essays about epic fantasy. And he asserted that fantasy is the literature of reintegration, meaning that fantasy is a type of literature, unlike a lot of modern literature, where it seems to be an expression of our angst, an expression of our absurdity, of our lack of meaning in a universe that lacks meaning. But fantasy, epic fantasy specifically, there are kinds of fantasy that don't do this, but epic fantasy is an attempt to engage with a story or journey of a sort that confers meaning, a sense of empowerment, not only upon the characters, but on the readers as they vicariously take part in that journey. So the character goes through this epic quest, or, try, plays a role in the survival of their culture or their world or whatever it might be. And there's a sense of empowerment at the end of that, a sense of identity, a sense of meaning. And Donaldson contends, and I like this idea, that epic fantasy is, in the sense of it being a literature of reintegration, is fantasy that confers meaning upon the reader, that gives the reader a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, that gives the reader a purpose, at least vicariously, that you emerge from that story psychologically cleansed and feeling, oh wow, this life is, you have a kind of clarity that maybe you didn't have before the adventure. So that is one way of going about defining this. I don't know. What do you think of all that, Christian?
Man, all of that was great, but I really like the part where you talk about the myth and legends and all that,
Yeah.
because that is one through line that I've noticed through all of the epic fantasy books that I've been reading
Yeah.
lately. And one especially is, I'll just hold up books here, but The Wheel of Time, Eye of the
Yeah.
World is book one. That,
Yeah.
like, epic fantasy to me feels like a conversation with our current reality and history, and kind of speaking to past myths and legends and all that. I
Yeah.
also want to show the Mahabharata, which I'm reading currently. I'm
Oh, brilliant.
I'm
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
early in it, I'm about 10%.
Same edition that I have.
Oh,
Wonderful.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing that I've noticed is that there's so much inspiration taken from these old myths and uh, legends, and the Odyssey is one of my favorites, and it completely encapsulates high fantasy in general, because you have the hero's journey going on, you
Hmm.
have various locations, you have multi characters, a large cast of characters,
Yeah.
and it's just I think that's one of the defining characteristics of epic fantasy is sort of a large cast going on an adventure, and they're not always together, they're always kind of splitting off and going on different adventures, and some of them are very internal adventures, wrestling with themselves, and a lot of it is also external, which, as we get to end of fantasy series, it always seems to converge into an external threat.
Uh huh.
And I'm actually almost done with this book, and I'll be going on to book 8. But I'm reading Return of the Crimson God right now
Oh,
by
cool.
Ian Esselmont, and I'm
Cool.
loving it. I've been reading it this past week, and that feels like convergence is such a heavy theme of this series,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
and I just love it. It's one of my favorite series right now, and I already know it's gonna be my top rated of all time.
So
So
are you doing a read of the Malazan Book of the Fallen and novels of the Malazan Empire all together? Is that what you're doing?
yes, I am. I'm going. I guess by release order. I was using
Yeah.
Critical Dragon's video on reading
Good,
order
good,
to help me.
good, good. Wait, you're
So
listening to AP? Oh
I
no.
am. I know you're his nemesis.
That's right. That's right. But he is rather intelligent about these things, so probably good idea to listen to him. Yeah.
Oh yeah. But it's just amazing, like how many overlaps there are between epic fantasy and our own history. That's
Yeah.
why I think it's a great. I think it's a conversation between the two, and also the author's own history, which Wheel of Time, you had Robert Jordan's history with the Vietnam War and how
That's
that
right.
threads itself through the entire series.
That's
So
really important. Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
yeah, so I guess we can go on to the next question. Are there any specific authors within the last 2 decades, we'll say maybe 3 decades, that you think encapsulate the word epic the most, and sort of why do they encapsulate that?
Well, Steven Erickson would be my first answer,
Same.
and I think Robin Hobb as well, with her Realm of the Elderlings. And I think that Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time is a very good example as well. Jenny Wirtz and the Wars of Light and Shadow, epic fantasy for sure. I think in the sense that I was just talking about earlier, and you as well. These are vast. All of these series are vast and take on some pretty huge existential questions in the process. They're thematically deep. They are um, they're entire worlds, and they are wrestling with the questions of what it means to be a human, to exist, and to try to derive meaning from our existence. All of them do that, I think, in ways that are really engaging. I think that Stephen Donaldson himself in his Thomas Covenant series, probably. Why not throw in Lord of the Rings? I think Lord of the Rings is a very fine older example. Um, yeah, maybe RC as well. Ursula Le Guin's RC books. You know, but yeah, there we you could go on and on. There are other kinds of fantasy that are clearly not epic fantasy, and there's nothing wrong with those subgenres either. They perform different functions. I think actually often very important functions too. Like for example, grimdark, as people have been calling it for a while. It goes further back than that label, than the existence of that label. But grimdark is, I feel like, the fantasy genre's response to existentialism in a way, where existentialism essentially says there is no intrinsic meaning in the universe, but you can craft meaning. You, as an individual, you can carve it out of your experience, out of your life, and you can find it if you work hard enough. Whereas nihilism is there is no meaning and nothing you do, nothing matters, nothing that you do will make a difference, really, essentially. Yeah. So I think that you know, fantasy does not have to be affirming in that sense. That I feel that, like, say, Malazan is, where Malazan is a series that really engages with questions about what is compassion, and how do you arrive at empathy? What does it mean to be in communion with other people, to understand one's connection to other people? That kind of questioning, that kind of engagement is what epic fantasy does, I think, really beautifully, on a usually on a scale that's pretty big, right? Where there's a transcendence involved in epic fantasy, I believe, where the individual, both the character in the story and the reader, experiences a sense of transcendence beyond their own individual self, where they feel a sense of connection to a broader group of people, society, of life in general, and then that transcendence confers meaning on the individual. So, but yeah, I think there are some great authors who are still around, who are doing some really cool epic fantasy.
Yeah, I would say Steven Erickson would be the first one I would say as well. He just every book feels like an entire book series, like if it's not by Steven Erickson. And I would also say Realm of the Eldenlings, and I'm actually starting book three soon
Oh,
of
cool.
Live Ship Traders.
Oh, Life of
Probably tomorrow.
Traders.
Yeah,
Nice.
it's oh my god, I loved Farsia trilogy, but this is even better.
I
I
actually
love it.
agree. I love Farseer too, but I feel like the Life of Traders is where I realized, oh wow, Robin Hobb is actually a genius. She's,
Yeah.
I liked Farseer fine, but I really felt that she hit her stride in Life of Traders, and in the next trilogy, the Tawny Man is my favorite of the entire series, with a very close second being Fitz and the Fool, which is the final trilogy. Before that is the Ringwild's Chronicles, which is actually a tetralogy. But yeah, but as a whole, it's an incredible vision that Robin Hobb puts forth, and it is again an exploration of our connection to others, to other people,
Hmm.
to the world around us. The web of being is something that Robin Hobb explores like no other, in a way that I find just so enriching and meaningful. I finish a book by Robin Hobb and I feel like I have a place in the universe, you know?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I have a much better understanding of the world every time I finish a book by her.
Yeah.
And I also really like the themes that she tackles with like the human connection to nature and animals
Yeah.
as well, especially with a night song or the actual live ships itself and
Yeah.
the sentient ships. Like it's just amazing, sort of.
It is. And you know who else does that really, really brilliantly is Jenny Wirtz in the Wars of Light and Shadow.
I have
Uh,
this stack of it. I got
oh,
them all for
nice.
about $1 each from the used
Oh,
bookstore. So
good for you.
yeah,
Wow.
it's been on my list a while now that the newest book has come out, or the final
Yeah.
book.
The final
I'm
book in
ready
the
to dive
series.
in.
Yep. Book 11, Song of Mysteries is out. Yep. I'm on the sixth book in that series right now, myself. So I haven't finished it yet, but I could feel where it's going. And
Hmm.
it's, it belongs in this conversation for sure.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. So with that in mind, we've touched on this a little bit, but my next question is: in what ways do real-world cultures and mythologies influence the settings and characters in
Uh-huh.
epic fantasy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's partly the individual author's inclination, let's say. We'll have authors who engage with, and you mentioned Steven Erickson. We talked about him. He's clearly engaging to some degree with the way the gods are portrayed in Greek mythology, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. The way that the Malazan world has its ascendancy and all of that. And by the way, Ian Esselmont, when I say Steven Erickson, Ian Esselmont often does very similar things, as you
Oh
know,
yeah.
if you're reading his series too. But they play around with things that you often see in the Greek stories, where the gods they have all their machinations and their puppet strings, and they're trying to assert their dominance over the other gods, and they're using mortals in that game. So that's there. I personally love Norse mythology, and I know that a writer like Neil Gaiman has written a lot of Norse-inspired stuff in his various series. You see um, other authors who much more directly will derive a either sort of a sort of a I guess a version of the mythology that they're engaging with, if you want to put it that way. I do a little bit of that myself in my own trilogy, in the Adan trilogy, where clearly the Theos are Norse, and they have a mythology that is very similar to what we know about Norse mythology. So you see it fairly common, I think. And there is something about these old stories. I think that a lot of us who are attracted to fantasy are also attracted to myth and legend and that kind of thing. Like we're on a quest, we're on a quest for meaning. And we find it in these old stories, and we find it in authors who are engaging in a dialogue, as it were, with these old stories as well. There is some kind of derivation of meaning just from the quest itself, just from the dialogue that we're digging for meaning is maybe the way we find meaning is just in the process of looking for it, you know. So it's not the end of the journey, but it's the quest itself, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah, there's no end to authors who, I mean, if you want to look at all the Arthurian stuff and the various authors who've done retellings of Arthurian myth and all of that, you know, there's just no end to it in fantasy, really. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, one thing that I love about the Wheel of Time is that it brings in so many different mythologies
Oh
that is
yes.
inspired by it. I last year, I think, or maybe 2 years ago, they released the origins of the Wheel of Time, where it
Uh huh.
explained all the different influences that Robert Jordan had, and he wrote out like this equals this equals that. Like
That's really
it was,
cool.
yeah, it was really interesting. I highly recommend it. It's like 200 pages, and the rest of the pages are like A to Z. Like this term is derived from this.
Yeah.
It's really great. And I think Tolkien as well really tackles with that as well, making his own
Yes.
mythology. So
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, and part of Tolkien's reason for doing what he did was he kind of yearned for an English mythology, which, you know, we have tiny references. We have Beowulf. We have a few references in other poems to what the Anglo-Saxons believed before they were Christianized. But a lot of that just got expunged from the culture when they became Christian, understandably, because you know, before Christianity, these Germanic tribes were not literate. They didn't have writing. They didn't preserve their stories in writing. It was only with Christianity that they became literate and were able to write down stories. And of course, it's the new religion. They're not going to necessarily be interested in preserving the old religion, right?
hmm
Iceland was different. Iceland was the exception to that rule, really, where they got Christianized much later than the Anglo-Saxons. And when it happened, it's around 1000 or so AD. When it happened, for some reason or other, they were just much more tolerant of the older culture and kept those stories alive. And even when literacy came into the equation, they used it to record the old stories as well. So almost everything we know about Germanic mythology is from Iceland. You know, yeah,
I did not know that. That's really interesting. Thank you.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so my next one is one that I'm really excited to talk about, which is how does world building contribute to the overall impact of an epic fantasy story? What are some examples of particularly effective world building?
Wow. So some of the same authors we've been talking about. Really, if you want to make a short list, there are authors that I think are notable for their world building. We haven't talked about George R. R. Martin yet, so I can bring him up.
Oh
You
yeah,
know, Song of
definitely.
Ice and Fire. The world building is vast. Brandon Sanderson also is a major world builder, I would say. In the Stormlight Archive, you can see his attempt to do something kind of like the Wheel of Time, a large, complex world with different cultures living alongside each other. So I think that's a good example as well. But of course, Malazan, both authors, Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings, Jenny Wirtz's Wars of Light and Shadow, all exhibit tremendous world building in their stories. So those are the ones that come to my mind. But there probably are others out there. I don't know if you have any others to add, Christian.
Yeah, I would say I, I'm going back and forth, but Gene Wolfe
Ah,
I feel like
yes,
has
yeah,
really great world building because on the
yeah.
surface is like you just read it straight through in like a week or so, you may not pick up on a lot of the world building, but
There's a
as
lot
you delve
on here.
into it, you kind of discover, oh, it's millions of years later in our own history.
Yeah.
Like this is crazy. Like
Yeah, no, Gene Wolfe was a brilliant author. I'm not sure how to categorize Book of the New Sun, honestly.
yeah, that's why I was hesitating.
I don't think it's epic fantasy, but you know, there may be elements of it in there. It is, of course, you know, a dying Earth kind of story, or post-apocalypse, or whatever, sci-fi. You know, it's got fantasy elements for sure, but
hmm
it also is, I think, Gene Wolfe's quest for meaning, or Severians. So yeah, I do think that he's got some important elements of epic fantasy. in there as well. But that one's tough to categorize, I think.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, and I've always meant to ask, but have you read the sequels to Book of the New Sun?
No, I haven't read Earth of the New Sun yet. I've only read Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. That's
Okay,
those four books are the only thing I've read by him so far. I will follow up though with Earth of the New Sun eventually.
okay, cool. Yeah, because I'm on book 3 now. I actually need to reread the first two books because it's been about half a year, and I don't even want to attempt to pick up
Yeah,
book 3 after that long without reading it. So,
I think it's one of those series where it makes you get more out of it the more times you read it.
oh yeah.
So, but I'll have to reread it someday, I'm sure, and maybe I'll see more than I did the first time around. But it is interesting because he does engage with some really cool philosophical stuff in there. I love the way he engages with language as
Oh
well,
yeah.
and where do we derive meaning from language as an agreed upon conventions that we have these essentially words we're creating with our lungs and our throats and our mouths as we manipulate the air and it hits our eardrums and vibrates and we interpret that as something that makes sense and uh, we agree on these symbols and what they mean. But I think that there is a way in which language it confers meaning, but it also distorts in a sense in ways that Gene Wolfe is just brilliant at exploring all of this. So yeah, I love the way he goes about looking at meaning and identity and memory. All these things he
Hmm.
weaves into this really in a bizarre and complex and compelling way. Yeah,
Yeah, and I would also add Stephen Erickson to the whole language and memory and all that. Because as
sure.
I'm reading through the novels of Malazan Empire, I'm always shocked when a main character shows up and I'm like, why are they here? And it ends up it's actually a memory that this other character is experiencing. And
Sure.
I'm like, whoa, like, okay. Like,
Yeah.
I just love that, like how Cam and Steven deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah. They're both just brilliant authors. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can go on to the next question.
Okay.
Gods are typically in epic fantasy and have wide ranges of impact on the characters and the story within the genre. What are some series that you think deal with gods the most interestingly, and what series do those gods, or what sets those gods above other gods in the genre?
Wow. So once again, Malazan, that's the one that springs to mind, the most obvious. And it's interesting because I often find it um, curious. I'm curious about how an author goes about deciding whether or not to include gods in their world as part of the world, because there are a couple of different ways you can go about this. And I think it could be epic fantasy either way, but you have the Malazan example where the gods are definitely entities that exist in within the world and they're part of the narrative and they're vying for power. And then you have other kinds of epic fantasy where the gods aren't they don't ever show up on the page. We don't know if they're actually real or not. We know that the characters believe in them, and maybe sometimes they have a remote effect on the world, but it's left a little ambiguous or something like that. But it's interesting how there's a range there, I guess you could say, where gods directly interfere, their characters, they're present on the page, and then other presentations of it where it's really more about the characters' beliefs about the gods that affect their actions. But we don't know if the gods are actually doing anything or not, right? So that's an interesting, I think, um, spectrum you have there. So an example might be we haven't mentioned Tad Williams yet, but his Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy, which I really admire. I would call that epic fantasy, and you do have a lot in there about belief. You have some religions that feel a little bit like they're modeled on real world religions in ways, but it's never the case. If I remember, it's been a while since I read it, but it's never the case in there where you have too much like of the gods just coming in and saying, "Da-da," it's more about the beliefs of the characters. They're much older cultures with different belief systems, but we don't see the gods directly interfering. I think that's probably the majority. There aren't as many where you see. Um, there another one that it's not epic fantasy, but where you do see the gods directly playing roles is in that Percy Jackson books, right?
Oh yeah.
There's one where you have the Greek and the Roman gods, and I think that author also goes into other mythology. He does Norse stuff as well, I think. So,
Egyptian as well.
yep. Okay. Yeah, I haven't actually read them, but my daughters were very taken with those books at one point when they were younger. So yeah, I think that you can choose as an author. Am I going to have the gods be players in my story, or are they simply entities that are? It's not clear whether they even exist or not, but we know the characters believe in them. And there's probably something in between all that too.
Yeah, I really like the George R. R. Martin example because that was
Yes.
something that because I've been involved in that fandom since 2011 or so,
Okay.
and I was still in high school, so
Yeah.
like it's been most of my life I've been deeply involved in that fandom, and that's something we always argue about is like are the old gods real?
Are they real? Yeah.
Yeah, like is Azor High like an actual figure that will become real, or is that just like
Yeah.
just an idea?
And he
And
leaves it ambiguous. He really does.
oh yeah, and another example is Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere with the different shards, because I would
Yeah.
argue they're definitely gods.
Yeah. I think in that world, there definitely were gods. And as to whether or not they're, what state they're in currently, that is a matter of debate. But yes, with his shards of this initial, there's a whole mythology that is part of his Cosmere that you could get into. But ultimately, I think there is a definite belief in the existence of that narrative that this is real somehow in that world, and that these gods, whether or not they have much conscious exertion of will over the events of the present, they definitely did exist, and their existence has repercussions that ripple throughout all these different stories. So yeah.
And it's also interesting how the shards themselves affect the magic system, which I didn't
Uh-huh.
write any questions about, but we could go into that a bit as sort of the different magic systems within epic fantasy and how do
Yes.
they contribute to the genre.
Yeah. So the idea of a magic system is definitely something that's more recent, I guess you could say. And with Brandon Sanderson, of course, being a very influential presence within the fantasy genre, I think he's not solely responsible, but a lot of the idea of just a magic system already implies really what he calls hard magic. He has delineated this. Really, it's a spectrum, I guess. It's not an either or. It's hard magic or it's soft magic, right? There's a lot of in between there. Like you could say, Wheel of Time, for example, it's not as hard magic-y as Stormlight Archive, but it's definitely more hard magic than say Lord of the Rings, right? Where Lord of the Rings being an example of what Sanderson calls soft magic, but that's a relatively recent label. So and people might have their preferences and that kind of thing. I think it's possible to tell a great story with either one. Honestly, I don't think it's you know one is bad and the other is good or anything like that. It's just that it's a matter of preference, really, for the author and the reader. But yeah, you do have, I think, in the minds of a lot of modern fantasy readers, this dichotomy maybe between hard and soft magic systems. But when I was younger, growing up, these terms didn't exist, and it was just magic. And I feel like there was just a less perceived need to explain the magic in older fantasy. That it's just magic. You don't have to explain it. It's there, right? Like in Lord of the Rings. And I do kind of like that, maybe because I grew up with that attitude or approach to magic. I like mystery around the magic. I don't need to have it explained for me in detail about how it works, because it almost sucks the wonder and the mystery out of it for me.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, I know a lot of people really enjoy having the magic explained in detail. And there are certainly, besides Brandon Sanderson, Brent Weeks, for example,
Hmm.
is a writer who definitely much more interested in centering the story around how the magic functions, and that can work really well. It's a great way to tell a story sometimes, I think. But for me, yeah, I just have a personal preference for the stories that leave a sense of mystery. I don't need to know in a scientific way how it works necessarily. I mean, this Patrick Rothfuss does something interesting, I think, in The Name of the Wind and in The Wise Man's Fear, where he has two magics and one of them looks like a soft magic system where it's the naming and that kind of thing. And then he has some that look more like hard magic in a way, right? They're explained in a way that's pseudoscientific, and they're taught at a university in a way that they're like an academic discipline or something. So you can even combine them, right?
Oh yeah, and one thing is you mentioned already that you've written a trilogy already, and I believe you're working on the sequel now from one
I
of your
am.
recent videos.
That's correct.
What do
Yeah.
you write in terms of magic system?
Oh, mine I would categorize as not the softest of soft magics, but definitely more leaning toward the soft side. I do have moments where the characters are talking about how it works, but it's very spiritual in nature, I guess you could say. In fact, the magic that I've included in my trilogy and in this sequel is very much based on Eastern philosophy, on Hinduism and Buddhism, the more philosophical aspects of Hinduism, Buddhism. The idea, again, that we were talking about connection earlier, but the idea that not only are we impermanent, but we're really part of everything around us. And that, yeah, and even on some level, your individuality is a very temporary state and might even be an illusion, that you're part of the fabric of life, and you really, it's like this analogy that I like to bring up, from an author that I read, named Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Buddhist monk who wrote some really cool books about Buddhism. But in one of them, I read his comparison to the individual is like a wave on the surface of the water, and that wave, in its brief moment of existence, thinks it's a happy little wave. It's separate. Somehow it's separate from the rest of the water, but really that wave has always been part of the water and is going back to the water, and will cease to exist as an individual wave, but will still exist as part of the water, right? And that's kind of how you look at the individual's place in the universe. That we think we're separate, we think we're an individual, we have this ego that goes around thinking I'm very important. When in fact we're just part of everything. And that recognition is central to how magic works in my trilogy. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love this whole idea of like predestination versus free will within fantasy, because this
Sure.
is something also that Robert Jordan really tackles is the
Yes.
idea of the pattern and whether you have really any influence upon the pattern and where your life goes. You have the
Yeah.
dragon who influences, and also the oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of it, but the other, oh, Taviran, you have the other Taviran
Very.
around
Yeah.
who affect the pattern, but
Yeah. Yeah.
they also have these legends that say, oh, the dragon is going to do this and the dragon's going to do that. And you also have the different
Yeah.
uh, cultures' prophecies going on, the sea folk prophecies that say, oh, the dragon has to do this. The
Right.
Sanshin as well have prophecies saying, oh, the dragon has to do this. And
Right.
it's very flexible too as well, so it's kind of like, is it free will or not?
Yeah. It's an exploration. And then you'll have some authors who absolutely assert, yes, free will. I just read a Dresden Files book
Oh yeah.
where, in book 7, Deadbeat, where it's a very clear message in there, uh, to the protagonist that your free will matters, and you decide what you're going to be, even if there's other big forces around you that are pushing and pulling you. Whereas I'm also reading, I'm in the last couple books of R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse series, And that's a series where he comes down pretty hard on the idea that, yeah, no, we don't really have any free will.
Yeah.
We can delude ourselves, and that's fine if that helps you get by. But the fact of the matter is, really, you don't have any free will, probably. But if you have any at all, it's infinitesimal and probably doesn't do much. But yeah, that series is, I mean, just deeply philosophical, but it explores that idea of free will too. So yeah, that is definitely an idea that gets explored a lot in not just fantasy but in literature. Milton was obsessed with it in Paradise Lost.
Mhm.
The idea of free will, that's a central theme, really. So,
Yeah, really good. I just love talking about all of this. And one thing that's sort of a sillier question is there such thing as a minimum page length to epic fantasy? Because
yeah.
anytime it's discussed within the community, it's everyone says, "Oh, it has to be this, door stopper,
Right.
tome."
Yeah, I feel like everyone has this perception that epic means vast, that it means there's a sort of a scale that you have to be somewhere on in order to qualify. I'm not sure how meaningful that is, though. I don't find that to be a satisfying way of going about defining this, at least for me. I don't know where that came from. Why epic got this connotation of just big,
Hmm.
and when we talk about something being epic, wow, that was an epic game, that was an epic match or whatever, meaning it went on a long time and it felt big. I guess that's just how the word has how it's evolved in our popular conception. But in terms of how we can define epic fantasy, I don't think just mere scale is enough, right? We've talked about quite a few series, though, and even in our discussion, whether it's because we're unconsciously buying into this scale definition or not, we tend to talk about the bigger series, don't we? When we talk about epic fantasy, but yeah, it doesn't feel like anyway that's enough, right? Just to have something be long.
Hmm.
you know the I don't know, that manual to my microwave is really long. Does that make it an epic manual? So I don't know. But yeah, there are certain things that get defined as epic, that uh, are they epic? Are they really? I don't know. So a lot of people think of Beowulf as an epic poem. I don't, actually. I think it's more of a lament, and it's not that long either. It's only about 3,182 lines, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Whereas when you're talking about the Iliad or something, that's more like 10,000 lines. So that's longer. Um, but I think there are more meaningful reasons why maybe the Iliad is an epic and Beowulf is not.
Yeah, I agree. Because when I go to the bookstore, I'm not looking for the biggest book, but sort of more word of mouth and
Yeah,
what I know about the series. Like when I picked up the Mahabharata, for example, people
yeah,
said, "Oh, it's epic. It has this large cast, millions of characters, tons of gods." And I said, "That's my jam. I want to
yeah.
read that." But
But is it epic because it's long, or is it epic because it explores questions about our existence and our relations with all the people and the beings around us? Which is it? Or do you have to have both? I don't know. Yeah.
yeah, I would say it's definitely the latter one because to me, I always visualize the word epic as like a tapestry or a quilt maybe where it's made up of many different parts and they all add to the whole picture.
I
And
like
that
that.
can be the characters, the story, the themes, which we can touch on shortly,
Yeah.
and the various other elements that an author can use. So that's how I've
Yeah.
always just visualized it. And it's definitely not the biggest quilt that's the most beautiful. It's, the one that has the most substance. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so to move on to sort of the last question that I have,
Okay.
what are some typical themes within epic fantasy? And I guess we've already answered this a lot, but which series do you think tackle these themes most effectively?
Yeah. So I think epic fantasy tackles the big questions. Who are we? What are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we derive meaning? These are the big questions that epic fantasy tackles. And within the exploration of those questions, I think you will not necessarily, but you will often find attempts to answer those questions. Maybe not definitively, but to at least explore answers to those questions. And a lot of times, as I said from the beginning, it's in exploring those questions and groping our way toward answers to those questions that we find meaning itself. But it's often in fellowship. There is an emphasis in epic fantasy on fellowship. It's in the title of the first book in Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. And we often think of epic quests as quests not of the individual so much as the group, the quest group. And there is, I think, again, going back to Stephen Donaldson's definitions, a degree to which it's in that communion, in that cohesion, and the finding of connection with others that we find meaning in the process of going about the quest. Yeah, I think that's a big part of this. Yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Christian?
I feel like a lot of epic fantasy is dedicated to like good versus evil and sort
Uh-huh.
of exploring like what makes, good good and like what makes evil evil. Because this is one of my favorite themes with the Wheel of Time, which is explored in every single book. And you
Yeah.
can draw from so many different chapters saying, oh, this is what evil is. No, this is what good is. And I just love that sort of dichotomy and comparison because
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings goes into this a lot as well, which is, we have to defeat the big, dark, evil,
Right.
overlord,
Which
Sauron.
exists in Wheel of Time as well. You have
Yeah,
Shite and all that.
yep.
Yeah.
And I just sort of love that exploration because it's such a simple yet very expansive and explorable theme to have.
Yeah, I agree with you that in a way it feels simple, but I do think that let's give credit to Robert Jordan and J.R.R. Tolkien too, because there is more nuance as well. For example, in a character like Rand, who is he's clearly the chosen one and all that, but within that there are moments of real doubt and temptation, and he's not that he everything he does is golden in the series. He has moments of serious, like, you can kind of question, is he going to go the Frank Herbert Dune route, where the chosen one becomes something very dangerous, um, or is he going to restore order to the world or whatever? Tolkien has a lot of nuance, I think. Not Yes, there's good and there's evil in there. That's clear. And you have orcs that are massacred by the thousands, and no one even questions or feels bad about it, right? And then you have the good characters from Gondor, and the writers of Rohan and all that. They're all the good guys, but within that clear dichotomy, I think there is some nuance. You have characters like Gollum, who is clearly uh, presented in the beginning in The Hobbit when you first meet him as an evil creature, uh, but pitiable. And then we kind of see him in Lord of the Rings really being capable of redemption. That he has this journey of going of through his fellowship with Frodo and Sam, of recovering some of his humanity or his hobbitness or whatever, right? And there, I think, was a very real possibility of Gollum ultimately, perhaps, becoming redeemed. It doesn't happen, but it was possible, I think. Um, you have characters who are on the side of good who are clearly tempted by Power of the Ring and what it would become. Gandalf refuses to touch it because he realizes, I probably would give in to the temptation to use it, and maybe for good at first, but I know where I'd go. I'd end up like Saruman. So yeah, Saruman was initially a good, a force of good, and found himself corrupted himself, through the desire for power. So there's nuance. You have Boromir, he's one of the nine. He's in the fellowship. He succumbs to temptation because he wants to do it for good, right? But so that's something Tolkien is exploring. I think there's some subtlety to that exploration of morality there. Like, oh, is it okay to seize power if you're doing it for good, right? What does that make you when you seize power and use it for good? Are you still the good in that situation? So questions very much worth exploring.
Yeah, I love the theme of redemption as well because there's so many examples throughout fantasy where people argue whether this character should be redeemed or not. Like as the books are coming out, like Stormlight Archive. I don't want to say any character names, but there's a few characters where they're evil currently, and people are saying, "I don't want a redemption story. I don't want them to be redeemed." But some people are like, "Well, I think everyone deserves redemption," and that's sort of where I lean more towards,
Yeah.
because for like A Song of Ice and Fire, for example, Theon. Uh, it's not a spoiler at this point. It's been out for a long time, but and
It's been
everyone
out for a
knows.
while.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
I
no,
think
he's a good example.
yeah, I think his redemption story is just so powerful because
Yeah.
you see him in the beginning of a Game of Thrones, or I believe Clash of Kings. He comes in, and he's just a ward for Ned Stark, and
Right.
then everything that happens in book two happens, and we don't see him for a long, long time. And then
Right.
we see him again in A Dance with Dragons, and he is just completely different. You don't even recognize him. And when it's revealed that it's Theon, you're kind of like, oh no. Like, where are
Yeah.
we headed now? Like,
Yeah.
and that's something that I love to argue about is whether characters deserve redemption or not within
Yeah.
different series.
It's fairly important exploration. It's something I tried to do a little bit in my trilogy too, was to take a couple characters that are evil, right? And you might not like them, but then complicate matters a little bit by showing us a little bit about where they're coming from and what they believe, and then it gets a little more nuanced, I think. So yeah, I like that when I see it too. Um, so yeah, we explore the big things in fantasy, don't we?
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't have any other questions. Are there any last thoughts that you have on this topic that you want to share?
No, I think I had a ton of fun chatting with you, Christian. I don't necessarily think the two of us came up with a completely compelling, watertight definition of epic fantasy, but again, I always feel like when I explore this question, it's a very worthy conversation, and that we can learn a lot about fantasy and epic fantasy, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
As we kind of dance around what it is. I think it's a subject that I love talking about, and it's my favorite kind of fantasy, whatever it is. If you say epic fantasy, I feel like that's my wheelhouse. That's what I love the most. And what I've written, I think my series is epic fantasy, probably.
I
um,
have it in my Kindle, so I'll let you know once I read
yeah,
it.
you
So.
tell me what you think, Christian. If you read it, if you think it's epic fantasy or not, I'll be curious. But thank
Definitely.
you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed meeting you and having this discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you again for joining me today and taking time out of your day to discuss this topic with me. I'm completely honored to have you on. I was not expecting you to be on. So,
Well, the honor's mine. I really appreciate you reaching out.
yep, thank you so much. And everyone, please go on to Philip's channel. I'll have it linked below. And thank you again. And please have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.